Hi all, Philip again with another announcement. As of recording, the Patreon is live, and I'm so happy to report we already have a patron at the $3 tier. Thanks to some feedback, we also have our first tier rewards set up. So at the $3 tier, citizens of Alexandria can vote in various polls and surveys on the future of the podcast, get a personal shout out at the beginning or end of each episode, and they can access what I call director's commentary, which are companion posts to each episode explaining my creative decisions, hidden or not so hidden references and intertexts, a bit on my sources, and a little behind the scenes secrets. The first director's commentary about episode 1 of the podcast should be live by the time this episode drops. At the $5 tier, scribes of the Great Library get all of that, plus access to bonus episodes, at least one per arc, so every 8 episodes-ish, set in the same time period but divorced from the main narrative. We also have a $10 Great Librarians tier for those feeling extra generous, but as of right now, no specific rewards set for that. Oh, and I intend to add more rewards in the future. So without further ado, this episode is brought to you by Slothinator, a citizen of Alexandria. Thanks, Slothinator. Now enjoy the show. Welcome to Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. Episode 5b, Demosthenes, the Third Philippic, and Funeral Oration. Demosthenes was a prolific speechwriter, rightly praised as one of, if not the best ancient orator of Greece. We have over 40 authentic lawsuit speeches, some written for others, but many for his own legal troubles with his guardians and other fellow citizens, as well as 17-ish political speeches. So for today, we have a ton of speeches to choose from, each and every one offering unique glimpses into aspects of Athenian life, from property disputes to charges of assault, from unpaid debts to charges of political corruption. But today, I'll just be performing two of the most relevant to our story in 341 BCE. Last time, you heard portions of On the Chersonese, a speech that convinced our friend Antiphanes and many fellow Athenians to keep the general Diopathes in the Chersonese and ultimately resist Macedonian encroachment. But even after he gave that speech in spring 341, Demosthenes still faced significant pushback from other prominent Athenian politicians who wished to appease Macedon, notably his rival Aeschines. That was until he delivered the Third Philippic, just a few months later in summer of 341. At that point, King Philip was still in Thrace, threatening the Chersonese Peninsula and threatening Byzantion on the Bosphorus. But technically, the peace of Philocrates was still intact. So imagine now that you are an Athenian citizen sitting on a blanket or cushion on the Pnyx as the orator steps up one summer morning and gives his speech. Demosthenes, the Third Philippic, 341 BCE. Many speeches are delivered, men of Athens, at almost every meeting of the assembly, about the wrongs that Philip has been committing ever since the conclusion of peace, not only against you, but also against the other states. And all the speakers would, I am sure, admit in theory, though they do not put it in practice, that the object both of our words and deeds must be to check and chastise his arrogance. Yet, I perceive that all our interests have been so completely betrayed and sacrificed that, I am afraid it is an ominous thing to say, but yet the truth, even if all who address you had wanted to propose, and all of you had wanted to pass, measures that were bound to bring our affairs into the worst possible plight, I do not think they could have been in a worse condition than they are today. Perhaps indeed, this condition of our affairs may be attributed to many causes, and not just to one or two. But a careful examination will convince you that it is above all due to those who study to win your favor rather than to give you the best advice. Some of them, Athenians, interested in maintaining a system which brings them credit and influence, have no thought for the future, and therefore think you should have none either. While others, by blaming and traducing those in authority, make it their sole aim that our city shall concentrate her attention on punishing her own citizens, while Philip shall be free to stay and do whatever he pleases. But such methods of dealing with public affairs, familiar though they are to you, are the cause of your calamities. I claim for myself, Athenians, that if I utter some home truths with freedom, I shall not thereby incur your displeasure. For look at it in this way. In other matters, you think it so necessary to grant general freedom of speech to everyone in Athens that you even allow aliens and slaves to share in the privilege. And many menials may be observed among you, speaking their minds with more liberty than citizens enjoy in other states. But from your deliberations, you have banished it utterly. Hence, the result is that, in the assembly, your self-complacency is flattered by hearing none but pleasant speeches, but your policy and your practice are already involving you in the gravest peril. Therefore, if such is your temper now, I have nothing to say. But if, apart from flattery, you are willing to hear something to your advantage, I am ready to speak. For though the state of our affairs is in every way deplorable, and though much has been sacrificed, nevertheless, it is possible, if you choose to do your duty, that all may yet be repaired. And what I am going to say may perhaps seem a paradox, but it is true. The worst feature of the past is our best hope for the future. What then is that feature? It is that your affairs go wrong because you neglect every duty, great or small. Since surely, if they were in this plight in spite of your doing all that was required, there would not even be a hope of improvement. But in fact, it is your indifference and carelessness that Philip has conquered. Your city he has not conquered. Nor have you been defeated. No, you have not even made a move. If then we were all agreed that Philip is at war with Athens and is violating the peace, the only task of a speaker would be to come forward and recommend the safest and easiest method of defense. But since some of you are in such a strange mood that, though Philip is seizing cities and retaining many of your possessions and inflicting injury on everybody, you tolerate some speakers who repeatedly assert in the assembly that the real aggressors are certain of ourselves. We must then be on our guard and set this matter right. For there is grave danger that anyone who proposes and urges that we shall defend ourselves may incur the charge of having provoked the war. I therefore first of all state and define this question: whether it is in our power to discuss the alternative of peace or war. If indeed Athens can remain at peace, and if the choice rests with us, to take that point first, I personally feel that we are bound to do so. And if anyone says that we can, I call upon him to move a resolution to do something and to play us no tricks. But if there is another person concerned, with sword in hand and a mighty force at his back, who imposes on you with the name of peace, but himself indulges in acts of war, what is left but to defend ourselves? If you choose to follow his example and profess that you are at peace, I raise no objection. But if anyone mistakes for peace an arrangement which will enable Philip, when he has seized everything else, to march upon us, he has taken leave of his senses, and the peace that he talks of is one that you observe towards Philip, but not Philip towards you. That is the advantage which he is purchasing by all his expenditure of money, that he should be at war with you, but that you should not be at war with him. If we are going to wait for him to acknowledge a state of war with us, we are indeed the simplest of mortals. For even if he marches straight against Attica and the Piraeus, he will not admit it, if we may judge from his treatment of the other states. For take the case of the Olynthians. When he was 5 miles from their city, he told them there must be one of two things. Either they must cease to reside in Olynthus, or he in Macedonia. Though on all previous occasions, when accused of hostile intentions, he indignantly sent ambassadors to justify his conduct. Again, when he marched against the Phocians, he still pretended that they were his allies, and Phocian ambassadors accompanied him on his march. And most people here at Athens contended that his passage through Thermopylae would be anything but a gain to the Thebans. And then again, quite lately, after entering Thessaly as a friend and ally, he seized Pherae and still retains it. And lastly, he informed those poor wretches, the people of Aureus, that he had sent his soldiers to pay them a visit of sympathy and all goodwill, for he understood that they were suffering from acute internal trouble, and it was the duty of true friends and allies to be at their side on such occasions. And do you imagine that, while in the case of those who could have inflicted no harm, though they might perhaps have protected themselves against it, he preferred to deceive them rather than to crush them after due warning. In your case, he will give warning of hostilities, especially when you are so eager to be deceived? Impossible! For indeed, he would be the most fatuous man on earth if, when you, his victims, charge him with no crime, but throw the blame on some of your own fellow citizens, he should compose your mutual differences and jealousies and invite you to turn them against himself, and should deprive his own hirelings of the excuses with which they put you off, saying that, at any rate, it is not Philip who is making war on Athens. But in heaven's name, is there any intelligent man who would let words rather than deeds decide the question who is at peace and who is at war with him? Surely no one. Now, it was Philip who at the very start, as soon as peace was concluded, before Diopathes was appointed general, before the force now in the Chersonese had been dispatched, proceeded to occupy Cerium and Doriscos, and expelled from the fort Cerium and the Sacred Mount the garrison which your own general had posted there. Yet, what did that move of his mean? For it was peace that he had sworn to observe. And let no one say, "What of all this? How do any of these things concern Athens?" For whether they were small things, or whether they were no concern of yours, may be another question. But religion and justice, whether a man violates them in a small matter or in a great, have the same importance. Tell me now, when he sends mercenaries to the Chersonese, your claim to which has been recognized by the king of Persia and by all the Greeks, when he admits that he is helping the Cardians and writes to tell you so, what does he mean? For he says that he is not at war. But for my part, so far from admitting that in acting thus he is observing the peace with you, I assert that when he lays hands on Megara, sets up tyrannies in Euboea, makes his way, as now, into Thrace, hatches plots in the Peloponnese, and carries out all these operations with his armed force, he is breaking the peace and making war upon you. Unless you are prepared to say that the men who bring up the siege engines are keeping the peace until they actually bring them to bear on the walls. But you will not admit that, for he who makes and devises the means by which I may be captured is at war with me, even though he has not yet hurled a javelin or shot a bolt. In what, then, consists your danger if anything should happen? In the alienation of the Hellespont? In the control of Megara and Euboea by one who is at war with you? And in the defection of the Peloponnesians to his side? And am I still to say that the man who brings this siege engine to bear on your city is at peace with you? So far from saying that, I date his hostility from the very day when he wiped out the Phocians. I say that you will be wise if you defend yourselves now, but if you let that opportunity pass, you will not be able to act even when you desire to. I so far dissent, Athenians, from all your other counselors that I do not think you ought to trouble yourselves now about the Chersonese or Byzantion. Help them, if you will, guard them from harm, supply the troops already there with all that they require, but let your deliberations embrace all the Greek states and the great danger that besets them. But I wish to tell you the grounds for my alarm about our condition, so that, if my reasoning is sound, you may adopt it as your own and take forethought for yourselves, even if you refuse to take it for the others also. But if I seem to you a driveler and a dotard, neither now nor at any other time pay any heed to me as if I were in my senses. As for the fact, then, that Philip rose to greatness from small and humble beginnings, that the Greek states are mutually disloyal and factious, and that the increase of Philip's power in the past was a far greater miracle than the completion of his conquests now that he has gained so much. These and all such topics of which I might expatiate, I will pass over in silence. I observe, however, that all men, and you first of all, have conceded to him something which has been the occasion of every war that the Greeks have ever waged. And what is that? The power of doing what he likes, of calmly plundering and stripping the Greeks one by one, and of attacking their cities and reducing them to slavery. Yet your hegemony in Greece lasted 73 years, that of Sparta 29, and in these later times, Thebes too gained some sort of authority after the Battle of Leuctra. But neither to you, nor to the Thebans, nor to the Lacedaemonians did the Greeks ever yet, men of Athens, concede the right of unrestricted action or anything like it. On the contrary, when you, or rather the Athenians of that day, were thought to be showing a want of consideration in dealing with others, all felt it their duty, even those who had no grievance against them, to go to war in support of those who had been injured. And again, when the Lacedaemonians had risen to power and succeeded to your position of supremacy, and when they set to work to encroach on others and interfered unduly with the established order of things, all the Greeks were up in arms, even those who had no grievance of their own. Why need I refer to the other states? No, we ourselves and the Lacedaemonians, though at the outset we could not have specified any wrong at each other's hands, thought it our duty to fight on account of wrongs which we saw the other states suffering. Yet all the faults committed by the Lacedaemonians in those 30 years, and by our ancestors in the 70 years of supremacy, are fewer, men of Athens, than the wrongs which Philip has done to the Greeks in the 13 incomplete years in which he has been coming out to the top. Or rather, they are not a fraction of them. And this is easily proved by a short calculation. I pass over Olynthus and Methone and Apollonia and the 32 cities in or near Thrace, all of which Philip has destroyed so ruthlessly that any traveler would find it hard to say whether they had ever been inhabited. I say nothing of the destruction of the important nation of the Phocians. But how stands the case of the Thessalians? Has he not robbed them of their free constitutions and of their very cities, setting up tetrarchies in order to enslave them, not city by city, but tribe by tribe? Are not tyrannies already established in Euboea, an island, remember, not far from Thebes and Athens? Does he not write explicitly in his letters, "I am at peace with those who are willing to obey me"? And he does not merely write this without putting it into practice, but he is off to the Hellespont just as before he hurried to Ambracia. In the Peloponnese, he occupies the important city of Elis. Only the other day, he intrigued against the Megarians. Neither the Greek nor the barbarian world is big enough for that fellow's ambition. And we Greeks see and hear all this, and yet we do not send embassies to one another and express our indignation. We are in such a miserable position. We have so entrenched ourselves in our different cities that to this very day we can do nothing that our interest or our duty demands. We cannot combine. We cannot take any common pledge of help or friendship, but we idly watch the growing power of this man, each bent, or so it seems to me, on profiting by the interval afforded by another's ruin, taking not a thought, making not an effort for the salvation of Greece. For that Philip, like the recurrence or attack of a fever or some other disease, is threatening even those who think themselves out of reach. Of that, not one of you is ignorant. Aye, and you know this also, that the wrongs which the Greeks suffered from the Lacedaemonians or from us, they suffered at all events at the hands of true-born sons of Greece, and they might have been regarded as the acts of a legitimate son, born to great possessions, who should be guilty of some fault or error in the management of his estate. So far he would deserve blame and reproach, yet it could not be said that it was not one of the blood, not the lawful heir who was acting thus. But if some slave or supposititious bastard had wasted and squandered what he had no right to, heavens, how much more monstrous and exasperating all would have called it. Yet they have no such qualms about Philip and his present conduct, though he is not only no Greek, nor related to the Greeks, but not even a barbarian from any place that can be named with honor, but a pestilent knave from Macedonia, whence it was never yet possible to buy a decent slave. Yet what is wanting to crown his insolence? Not content with the destruction of cities, is he not organizing the Pythian Games, the common festival of the Greeks? And if he cannot be present in person, sending his menials to act as stewards? Is he not master of Thermopylae and the passes into Greece, holding those places with his garrisons and mercenaries? Has he not the right of precedence at the oracle, ousting us and the Thessalians and the Dorians and the rest of the Amphictyons from a privilege which not even all Greek states can claim? Does he not dictate to the Thessalians their form of government? Does he not send mercenaries, some to Porthmus to expel the Eretrian democracy, others to Oreos to set up the tyranny of Philistides? Yet the Greeks see all this and suffer it. They seem to watch him just as they would watch a hailstorm, each praying that it may not come their way, but none making an effort to stay its course. And it is not only his outrages on Greece that go unavenged, but even the wrongs which each suffers separately. For nothing can go beyond that. Are not the Corinthians hit by his invasion of Ambracia and Lucas? The Achaeans by his vow to transfer Naupactos to the Aetolians? The Thebans by his theft of Aquinas? And is he not marching, even now, against his allies, the Byzantines? Of our own possessions, not to mention other places, is he not holding Cardia, the greatest city in the Chersonese? In spite of such treatment, we hesitate, one and all. We play the coward. We keep an eye on our neighbors, distrusting one another rather than our common foe. Yet, if he treats us all with such brutality, what do you think he will do when he has got us each separately into his clutches? What, then, is the cause of all this? For not without reason, not without just cause, the Greeks of old were as eager for freedom as their descendants today are for slavery. There was something, men of Athens, something which animated the mass of the Greeks, but which is lacking now. Something which triumphed over the wealth of Persia, which upheld the liberties of Hellas, which never lost a single battle by sea or land. Something, the decay of which has ruined everything and brought our affairs to a state of chaos. And what was that? It was nothing recondite or subtle, but simply that men who took bribes from those who wished to rule Greece or ruin her, they were hated by all, and it was the greatest calamity to be convicted of receiving a bribe, and such a man was punished with the utmost severity, and no intercession, no pardon was allowed. At each crisis, therefore, the opportunity for action with which fortune often equips the careless against the vigilant, and those who shrink from deeds against those who fulfill their duties, could not be bought at a price from our politicians or our generals. No, nor our mutual concord, nor our distrust of tyrants and barbarians, nor, in a word, any such advantage. Now, however, all these things have been sold in open market, and in place of them we have imported vices which have infected Greece with a mortal sickness. And what are those vices? Envy of the man who has secured his gains, contempt for him who confesses, pardon for those who are convicted, hatred for him who censures such dealings, and every other vice that goes in hand with corruption. For war galleys, men in abundance, money and material without stint, everything by which one might gauge the strength of our cities, these we as a body possess today in number and quantity far beyond the Greeks of former times. But all our resources are rendered useless, powerless, worthless by these traffickers. That this is so, you surely see for yourselves with regard to the present, and you need no evidence of mine. But that it was the opposite in the days of old, I will prove, not in my own words, but by the written record of your ancestors, which they engraved on a bronze pillar and set up in the Acropolis. It was not for their own use, for without these documents, their instinct was right. But it was that you might have these examples to remind you that such cases ought to be regarded seriously. Arthemius of Zelia, it says, son of Pythonax, outlaw and enemy of the people of Athens and of their allies, himself and his family. Then it is recorded the reason for this punishment, because he conveyed the gold of the Medes to the Peloponnese. So runs the inscription. I earnestly implore you to consider What was the intention of the Athenians who did this thing? Or what was their proud claim? They proscribed as their enemy and the enemy of their allies, disfranchising him and his family, a man of Zelea, one Arthemius, a slave of the great king, for Zelea is in Asia, because in the service of his master, he conveyed gold, not to Athens, but to the Peloponnese. This was not outlawry, as commonly understood, for what mattered it to a native of Zelea if he was to be debarred from a share in the common rights of Athenian citizens? But the statutes relating to murder provide for cases where prosecution for murder is not allowed, but where it is a righteous act to slay the murderer. And he shall die an outlaw, says the legislator. This simply means that anyone slaying a member of Arthemius' family would be free from blood guilt. So our ancestors thought that they were bound to consider the welfare of all Greeks, for except on that assumption, bribery and corruption in the Peloponnese would be no concern of theirs. And in chastising and punishing all whom they detected, they went so far as to set the offender's name on a pillar. The natural result was that the Greek power was dreaded by the barbarian, not the barbarian by the Greeks. But that is no longer so. For that is not your attitude towards these and other offenses. What then is your attitude? You know it yourselves. For why should you bear the whole blame when all the other Greeks are just as bad as you? That is why I assert that the present crisis calls for earnest zeal and wise counsel. What counsel? Do you want me to tell you? And will you promise not to be angry? Here, the clerk reads from an official record. Now, there is a foolish argument advanced by those who want to reassure the citizens. Philip, they say, after all, is not yet what the Lacedaemonians were. They were masters of every sea and land. They enjoyed the alliance of the king of Persia. Nothing could stand against them. And yet, our city defended itself even against them and was not overwhelmed. But for my own part, while practically all the arts have made a great advance and we are living today in a very different world from the old one, I consider that nothing has been more revolutionized and improved than the art of war. For in the first place, I am informed that in those days, the Lacedaemonians, like everyone else, would spend the 4 or 5 months of the summer season in invading and laying waste the enemy's territory with heavy infantry and levies of citizens, and would then retire home again. And they were so old-fashioned, or rather, such good citizens, that they never used money to buy an advantage from anyone, but their fighting was of the fair and open kind. But now, you must surely see that most disasters are due to traitors, and none are the result of a regular pitched battle. On the other hand, you hear of Philip marching unchecked, not because he leads a phalanx of heavy infantry, but because he is accompanied by skirmishers, cavalry, archers, mercenaries, and similar troops. When, relying on this force, he attacks some people that is at variance with itself, and when through distrust no one goes forth to fight for his country, then he brings up his artillery and lays siege. I need hardly tell you that he makes no difference between summer and winter and has no season set apart for an action. Since, however, you all know this, you must take it into account and not let the war pass into your own country. You must not invite catastrophe through keeping your eyes fixed on the simple strategy of your old war with the Lacedaemonians, but arrange your political affairs and your military preparations so that your line of defense may be as far away from Athens as possible. Give him no chance of stirring from his base and never come to close grips with him. For so far as a campaign is concerned, provided, men of Athens, we are willing to do what is necessary, we have many natural advantages, such as the nature of his territory, much of which may be harried and devastated, and countless others. But for a pitched battle, he is in better training than we are. But it is not enough to adopt these suggestions, nor even to oppose him with active military measures, but both from calculation and on principle, you must show your hatred of those who speak publicly on his behalf. And you must reflect that it is impossible to defeat the enemies of our city until you have chastised those who, within our very walls, make themselves their servants. And that, as all heaven is my witness, you will never be able to do. But you have reached such a height of folly or of madness, or I know not what to call it, for this fear too has often haunted me, that some demon is driving you to your doom, that from love of calumny or envy or ribaldry, or whatever your motive might be, you clamor for a speech from these hirelings, some of whom would not even disclaim the title, and you will derive amusement from their vituperations. This is serious enough, but there is worse to follow, for you have granted to these men more security for the pursuance of their policy than to your own defenders. Yet, mark, what troubles are in store for those who lend an ear to such counselors. I will mention some facts which will be familiar to you all. At Olynthus, there were two parties in the state: Philip's men, entirely subservient to him, and the patriots, striving to preserve the freedom of their countrymen. Which, pray, ruined their country? Which betrayed the cavalry? Whose betrayal sealed the doom of Olynthus? The partisans of Philip, the men who, when the city was still standing, tried to defame and slander the patriotic statesman, until the Olympian democracy was actually induced to expel Apollonides. Now, it was not at Olynthus only that this habit produced every kind of evil result, but at Eretria, when the Democrats, ridding themselves of Plutarchus and his mercenaries, held the city together with Porthmus. Some of them were for handing the government over to you, others to Philip. The latter, on most points, or rather on all, gained the ear of the sorely tried and ill-starred Eretrians, and at last persuaded them to expel their real champions. For, of course, Philip, whom they fancied their ally, sent Hipponicus with 1,000 mercenaries, razed the walls of Porthmus, and set up 3 tyrants, Hipparchus, Automedon, and Clitarchus. Twice since then, they have tried to deliver themselves, and twice he has driven them from their homes, on the first occasion sending Eurylochus with his mercenaries, and on the second Parmenio. What need is there to mention most of the cases? But at Oreus, Philistides, Menippus, Socrates, Thoas, and Agapeus, the very men who now control the city, were, as everyone knew, Philip's agents. But Euphraeus, a man who once resided here at Athens, was working for the freedom and emancipation of his countrymen. It would be a long story to tell you how this man was repeatedly outraged and insulted by the people. But a year before the capture of Eretria, detecting the machinations of Philistides and his party, he denounced him as a traitor. Then, a number of fellows banded together with Philip for their paymaster and managing director, and dragged Euphraeus off to prison for setting the city in an uproar. When the Democrats of Oreus saw this, instead of rescuing him and knocking the others on the head, they showed no resentment against him and gloated over Euphraeus, saying that he deserved all he got. Then, having all the liberty of action they desired, they intrigued for the capture of the city and prepared to carry out their plot, while any of the common folk who saw what they were at were terrorized into silence, having the fate of Euphraeus before their eyes. And so abject was their condition that, with this danger looming ahead, no one dared to breathe a syllable until the enemy, having completed their preparations, were approaching the gates. And then some were for defense, the others for surrender. But since that base and shameful capture of the city, the latter have been its rulers and tyrants. Those who sheltered them before and had been ready to take any measures against Euphraeus were rewarded with banishment and death. And the noble Euphraeus slew himself, giving thus a practical proof of the honesty and disinterested patriotism of his opposition to Philip. Perhaps you wonder why the people of Olynthos and Eretria and Araeus were more favorably inclined to Philip's advocates than to their own. The explanation is the same as at Athens, that the patriots, however much they desire it, cannot sometimes say anything agreeable, for they are obliged to consider the safety of the state. But the others, by their very efforts to be agreeable, are playing into Philip's hands. The patriots demanded a war subsidy, and others denied its necessity. The patriots bade them fight on and mistrust Philip. The others bade them to keep peace until they fell into the snare. Not to go into particulars, it is the same tale everywhere. One party speaking to please their audience, the other giving advice that would have ensured their safety. But at the last, there were so many things that the people were induced to concede, not as before for their own gratification, nor through ignorance, but gradually yielding because they thought that their discomfiture was inevitable and complete. And by heaven, that is what I certainly fear will be your experience when you count your chances and discover that there is nothing left for you to do. And yet, I pray, Athenians, that such may not be the issue of events. Better to die 1,000 times than pay court to Philip and abandon any of your loyal counselors. A fine return the people of Araeus have gained for handing themselves over to Philip's friends and rejecting Euphraeus. A fine return the Democrats of Eretria have gained for spurning your embassy and capitulating to Clitarchus. They are slaves, doomed to the whipping post and the scaffold. A fine clemency he showed to the Olynthians, who voted Lasthenes their master of the horse and banished Apollonides. It is folly and cowardice to cherish such hopes, to follow ill counsel and refuse to perform any fraction of your duties, to lend an ear to the advocates of your enemies, and imagine that your city is so great that no conceivable damage can befall it. Aye, and a disgrace too it is to have to say when all is over, why, who would have thought it? For of course we ought to have done this or that, and not so and so. Many things could be named by the Olynthians today, which would have saved them from destruction, if only they had then foreseen them. Many could be named by the Orates, many by the Phocians, many by every ruined city. But what use to them is that? While the vessel is safe, whether it be a large one or a small one, then is the time for sailor and helmsman and everyone in his turn to show his zeal and to take care that it is not capsized by anyone's malice or inadvertence. But when the sea has overwhelmed it, zeal is useless. So we too, Athenians, as long as we are safe, blessed with a very great city, ample advantages, the fairest repute, what are we to do? Perhaps some of my hearers have long been eager to ask that question. I solemnly promise that I will answer it and will also move a resolution for which you can vote if so disposed. To begin with ourselves, we must make provision for our defense. I mean with war galleys, funds, and men. For even if all the other states succumb to slavery, we must surely fight the battle of liberty. Then, having completed all these preparations and made our purpose clear, we must lose no time in calling upon the other Greeks, and we must inform them by sending ambassadors in every direction to the Peloponnese, to Rhodes, to Chios, to the great king. For even his interests are not unaffected if we prevent Philip from subduing the whole country. So that, if you win them over, you may have someone to share your dangers and your expenses when the time comes. Or, if not, then you may at least delay the course of events. For since the war is against an individual and not against the might of an organized community, even delay is not without its use. Nor were those embassies useless when you sent round the Peloponnese last year to denounce Philip, when I and our good friend Polyeuctus here and Hegesippus and the rest went from city to city and succeeded in checking him so that he never invaded Ambracia nor even started against the Peloponnese. I do not, however, suggest that you should invite the rest, unless you are ready to do for yourselves what is necessary. For it would be futile to abandon our own interest and pretend that we are protecting those of others, or to overlook the present dangers and alarm our neighbors with dangers to come. That is not my meaning. But I do contend that we must send supplies to the forces in the Chersonese and satisfy all their demands. And while we make preparations ourselves, we must summon, collect, instruct, and exhort the rest of the Greeks. That is the duty of a city with a reputation such as yours enjoys. But if you imagine that Greece will be saved by Chalcidians or Megarians while you run away from the task, you are wrong. For they may think themselves lucky if they can save themselves separately. But this is a task for you. It was for you that your ancestors won this proud privilege and bequeathed it to you at great and manifold risk. But if every man sits idle, consulting his own pleasure and careful to avoid his own duty, not only will he find no one to do it for him, but I fear that those duties that we wish to shirk may all be forced upon us at once. These are my views, and these are my proposals. And if they are carried out, I believe that even now we may retrieve our fortunes. If anyone has anything better to propose, let him speak in advice. But whatever you decide, I pray heaven it may be to your advantage. Wow, what a speech. No wonder the Athenians were convinced. And as you know from last episode, Demosthenes became the de facto leader of an anti-Philip alliance. Well, as you also know from that episode, that didn't go well. Demosthenes survived the battle and was given the honor of making a funeral oration over the fallen Athenian soldiers in the Demosthenes Sema, the public cemetery for the most honored of citizens. So, imagine again that you are an Athenian, perhaps that same citizen who voted for the war, or perhaps his mother or father, now left bereft of a son. Demosthenes, the Funeral Oration, 338 BCE. After the state decreed that those who repose in this tomb, having acquitted themselves as brave men in the war, should have a state funeral, and appointed me to the duty of delivering over them the customary speech, I began straightway to study how they might receive their due tribute of praise. But as I studied and searched my mind, the conclusion forced itself upon me that to speak as these dead deserve was one of those things that cannot be done. For since they scorned the love of life that is inborn in all men, and chose rather to die nobly than to live and look upon Greece in misfortune, how can they have failed to leave behind them a record of valor surpassing all power of words to express? Nevertheless, I propose to treat the theme in the same vein as those who had previously spoken in this place from time to time. That the state seriously concerns itself with those who die in battle, it is possible to infer both from these rites in general and in particular from this law in accordance with which it chooses the speaker at our state funerals. For knowing that, among good men, the acquisition of wealth and the enjoyment of the pleasures that go with living are scorned, and that their whole desire is for virtue in words of praise, the citizens were of the opinion that we ought to honor them with such eulogies as would be most certainly securing them in death the glory they had won while living. Now, if it were my view that of those qualities that constitute virtue, courage alone was their possession, I might praise this and be done with the speaking. But since it fell to their lot also to have been nobly born and strictly brought up, and to have lived with lofty ideals, because of all which they had every reason to be good men, I should be ashamed if I were found to have passed over any of these topics. I shall begin from the origin of their race. The nobility of birth of these men has been acknowledged from time immemorial by all mankind. For it is possible for them, and for each one of their remote ancestors, man by man, to trace back their being, not only to a physical father, but also to this land of theirs as a whole, a common possession, of which they are acknowledged to be the indigenous children. For alone of all mankind, they settled the very land from which they were born, and handed it down to their descendants, so that justly one may assume that those who came as migrants into their cities and are denominated citizens of the same are comparable to adopted children. But these men are citizens of their native land by right of legitimate birth. In my view, also, the fact that the fruits of the earth by which men live were first manifest among us, even apart from their being a superlative boon to all men, constitutes an acknowledged proof that this land is the mother of our ancestors. For all things that bring forth young produce at the same time nutriment out of the organism itself for those that are born. This very thing has been done by this land. Such is the pride of birth that belongs to the ancestors of these men throughout the ages. As for courage and the other elements of virtue, I shrink from rehearsing the whole story, being on my guard for fear an untimely length shall attach to my speech. But such facts as it is worth while even for those who are familiar with them to recall to mind, and most profitable for the inexperienced to hear. Events of great power to inspire and calling for no tedious length of speech. These I shall endeavor to rehearse in summary fashion. For the ancestors of this present generation, both their fathers and those who bore the names of these men in times past, by which they are recognized by those of our race, never at any time wronged any man, whether Greek or barbarian, but it was their pride, in addition to all their other good qualities, to be true gentlemen and supremely just. And in defending themselves, they accomplished a long list of noble deeds. They so prevailed over the invading host of the Amazons as to expel them beyond the Phasis. And the host of Eumolpus and of many other foemen they drove not only out of their own land, but also from the lands of all the other Greeks, invaders whom all those dwelling on our front to the westward neither withstood nor possessed the power to halt. Moreover, they were styled the saviors of the sons of Heracles, who himself was the savior of the rest of mankind, when they arrived in this land as suppliants, fleeing before Eurystheus. In addition to all these and many other noble deeds, they refused to suffer the lawful rights of the departed to be treated with, despite when Creon forbade the burial of the 7 against Thebes. Now, omitting mention of many exploits that are classed as myths, I have recalled to mind the above-mentioned, each of which affords so many charming themes that our writers of poetry, whether recited or sung, and many historians, have made the deeds of those men the subjects of their respective arts. At the present time, I shall mention the following deeds, which, though in point of merit they are no whit inferior to the former, still, though being closer in point of time, have not yet found their way into poetry or even been exalted to epic rank. Those men, single-handed, twice repulsed by land and sea the expedition assembled out of the whole of Asia, and at their individual risks established themselves as the authors of the joint salvation of all the Greeks. And though what I shall say next has been said before by many another, still, even at this date, those dead must not be deprived of their just and excellent praise. For I say that with good reason, those men might be judged so far superior to those who campaigned against Troy, that the latter, the foremost princes out of the whole of Greece, with difficulty captured a single stronghold of Asia, after besieging it for 10 years. Whereas those men, single-handed, not only repulsed a host assembled from an entire continent, which had already subdued all other lands, but also inflicted punishment for the wrong done the rest of the Greeks. Furthermore, checking all acts of selfish aggrandizement among the Greeks themselves, assigning themselves to each station where justice was arrayed, they went on bearing the brunt of all dangers that chanced to arise until the lapse of time brings us to the generation now living. Let no one think I have enumerated this list of achievements because I am at a loss what to say about each of them. For if I were the most helpless of all men in discovering what it becomes me to say, the sheer virtue of those dead reveals sentiments that lie to hand and are easy to rehearse. It is my intention, however, after calling to mind their noble birth and the magnificent things done by their ancestors, with all speed to link my speech with the deeds of those dead, to the end that, just as they were akin in the flesh, so I may make the words of praise spoken over them to apply to both alike. I assume that this would be gratifying not only to their ancestors, but, best of all, to both them and these dead, if they should come to share one another's merit, not only by virtue of birth, but also by reason of our words of praise. In the meantime, it is necessary to interrupt my discourse for a moment before declaring the deeds of these men, to solicit the goodwill of those born outside this race who have accompanied us to the tomb. For if I had been appointed to do honor to this burial through expenditure of money, or by providing some different kind of spectacle consisting of equestrian or gymnastic contests, the greater my zeal and the more lavish my expenditure in preparing such spectacles, the better I should have been thought to have done my duty. Having been chosen, however, to extol these men in a speech, unless I have the sympathy of my hearers, I fear that because of my eagerness, I may effect the very opposite of what I ought. For wealth and speed of foot and strength of body and all other such things have their rewards self-assured to their possessors. And in those fields, they win who have the luck, even if not one of the others wishes their success. On the other hand, the persuasiveness of words depends upon the goodwill of the hearers, and with the help of this, even if the eloquence be moderate, it reaps glory and gains favor. But lacking this help, even if it be surpassingly good, it is thwarted by those who hear. Now, to resume my theme. Though many deeds of these men are at hand because of which they will be justly eulogized, I am at a loss what to mention first when I come face to face with the facts. For thronging into my mind as they do, all at once and at the same time, it becomes difficult to make a choice among them. I shall endeavor, however, to maintain the same order of topics in my speech as marked the course of the lives of these men. From the beginning, these men were outstanding in all the activities that formed their schooling, engaging in the exercises that became each stage of life, causing gratification to all who had claim to it, parents, friends, kinsmen. Therefore, just as if recognizing footprints, the memory of those who were near and dear to them now turns to these men every hour in fond recollection, finding many a reminder of occasions when they knew in their hearts that these were lads of surpassing worth. Arrived at manhood, they rendered their innate nobility known, not only to their fellow citizens, but to all men. For of all virtue, I say, and I repeat it, the beginning is understanding, and the fulfillment is courage. By the one it is judged what ought to be done, and by the other this is carried to success. In both of these qualities, these men were distinctly superior. For if ever a danger affecting all the Greeks was brewing, these were the first to foresee it. And time and again, they challenged the rest to save the situation. This action is a demonstration of sound judgment joined with public spirit. Although, again, there was much folly among the Greeks, not unmixed with slackness, a folly which failed to foresee some dangers and feigned not to see at a time when it was possible to avert these misfortunes without sacrificing safety. Nevertheless, when they did hearken and evinced willingness to do their duty, these men did not bear a grudge, but stepping forward and eagerly offering their all, bodies, money, and allies, they entered upon the ordeal of the contest, in which they were not sparing even of their lives. Of necessity, it happens, when a battle takes place, that the one side is beaten and the other victorious. But I should not hesitate to assert that, in my judgment, the men who die at the post of duty on either side do not share the defeat, but are both alike victors. For the mastery among the survivors is decided as the deity disposes, and that which each was in duty bound to contribute to this end, every man who has kept his post in battle has done. But if, as a mortal being, he meets his doom, what he has suffered is an incident caused by chance, but in spirit he remains unconquered by his opponents. It is my judgment, therefore, that we have to thank the valor of these men, along with the folly of their opponents, that our enemies did not set foot upon our land, because every man of them having had proof of their mettle, those who there engaged them on that occasion had no wish to confront in battle a second time the kinsmen of those men, suspecting that, although they would confront men of the same breed, they were not likely to find the fortune of battle so kind. Not the least reason for believing that this was their state of mind is afforded by the peace that was made. For it is impossible to cite a more plausible or more credible reason than that the master of our opponents, astounded at the valor of those who died, chose rather to be friendly towards their kinsmen than once more to assume the risk of all his fortunes. I believe also that if someone were to ask those in the opposite ranks whether they thought they had won by their own deeds of valor or by a startling and cruel turn of fortune and by the skill and daring of their own commander, not one of them would be so shameless or audacious as to claim credit for what happened. Furthermore, in contests of which the deity, the master of all, has disposed the outcome as it chose, it is necessary, of course, to acquit all others, being but human, of the charge of showing weakness. And where victory was won because the leader of our opponents prevailed over those appointed to the command of our army, no one could justly locate the cause in the rank and file of either the enemy or ourselves. But if, after all, there is any human being who might rightly lay a charge concerning the issue of that battle, he would with good reason advance it against those of the Thebans who were appointed to this command. Nor could anyone rightly lay blame upon the rank and file of either the Thebans or ourselves. Those men, receiving command of a military force that would neither brook defeat nor make excuse and had an emulous zest for glory, made the right use of none of these. As for the other questions touching this campaign, each individual is at liberty to draw conclusions according to his judgment. But what has become manifest to all living men alike is this, that in effect, the freedom of the whole Greek world could be preserved only with the lives of these men. At any rate, since fate removed them, not one of those remaining has made a stand against the foe. While I desire that my words may be free from offense, it seems to me that if one should declare that the valor of these men was the very life of Greece, he would speak the truth. For at one and the same time, their spirits were separated from their dear bodies, and the self-esteem of Greece was taken from her. We shall therefore seem guilty, perhaps of a bold exaggeration, but still it must be uttered. For just as if the light of day were removed out of this universe of ours, all the remnant of life would be harsh and irksome, so now that these men have been taken from us, all the old-time radiance of the Greeks is sunk in gloom and profound obscurity. While it stands to reason that many influences helped to make them what they were, not least was their virtue ascribable to our form of government. For though absolute governments dominated by a few create fear in their citizens, they fail to awaken the sense of shame. Consequently, when the test of war comes, everyone light-heartedly proceeds to save himself, knowing full well that if only he succeeds in appeasing his masters by presents or any other civility whatsoever, even though he becomes guilty of the most revolting conduct, only slight reproach will attach to him thereafter. Democracies, however, possess many other just and noble features to which right-minded men should hold fast. And in particular, it is impossible to deter freedom of speech, which depends upon speaking the truth, from exposing the truth. For neither is it possible for those who commit a shameful act to appease all the citizens, so that even the lone individual uttering the deserved reproach makes the guilty wince. For even those who would never speak an accusing word themselves are pleased at hearing the same, provided another utters it. Through fear of such condemnation, all these men, as was to be expected, for shame at the thought of subsequent reproaches, manfully faced the threat arising from our foes, and chose a noble death in preference to life and disgrace. The considerations that actuated these men, one and all, to choose to die nobly, have now been enumerated. Birth, education, habituation to high standards of conduct, and the underlying principles of our form of government in general. The incentives that challenged them severally to be valiant men, depending upon the tribes to which they belonged, I shall next relate. All the Erechtheidae were well aware that Erechtheus, from whom they have their name, for the salvation of this land gave his own daughters, whom they call the Hyacinthidæs, to certain death, and so expended their lives. Therefore, they regarded it as shameful, after a being born of immortal gods had sacrificed everything for the liberation of his native land, that they themselves should have been found to have placed a higher value upon a mortal body than upon immortal glory. Nor were the Aegaeidae ignorant that Theseus, the son of Aegeus, for the first time established equality in the state. They thought it, therefore, a dreadful thing to be false to the principles of that ancestor, and they preferred to be dead rather than, through love of life, to survive among the Greeks with this equality lost. The Pandionidae had inherited the tradition of Procne and Philomela, the daughters of Pandion, who took vengeance on Tereus for his crime against themselves. Therefore, they decided that life was not worth living unless they, akin by race, should have proved themselves to possess equal spirit with those women, when confronted by the outrage they saw being committed against Greece. The Leontidae had heard the stories related of the daughters of Leo, how they offered themselves to the citizens as a sacrifice for their country's sake. When, therefore, such courage was displayed by those women, they looked upon it as a heinous thing if they, being men, should have proved to possess less of manhood. The Achaemontidae did not fail to recall the epics in which Homer says that Acamas sailed for Troy for the sake of his mother Aethra. Now, since he braved every danger for the sake of saving his own mother, how were these men not bound to face every danger for the sake of saving their parents, one and all at home? It did not escape the Oeneidae that Semele was the daughter of Cadmus, and of her was born one whom it would be sacrilegious to name at this tomb, and by him Oeneus was begotten, who was called the founder of their race. Since the danger in question was common to both states, on behalf of both, they thought themselves bound to endure any anguish to the end. The Cecropidae were well aware that their founder was reputed to have been part dragon, part human, for no other reason than this, that in understanding he was like a man and strength like a dragon. So they assumed that their duty was to perform feats worthy of both. The Hippothoontidae bore in mind the marriage of Alope, from which Hippothoon was born, and they knew also who their founder was. About these matter, to avoid impropriety on an occasion like this, I forbear to speak plainly. They thought it was their duty to be seen performing deeds worthy of these ancestors. It did not escape the Iontidai that Ajax, robbed of the prize of valor, did not consider his own life worth living. When, therefore, the god was giving to another the prize of valor, at once they thought they must die trying to repel their foes so as to suffer no disgrace to themselves. The Antiochidae were not unmindful that Antiochus was the son of Heracles. They concluded, therefore, that they must either live worthily of their heritage or die nobly. Now, though the living kinsmen of these dead deserve our sympathy, bereaved of such brave men and divorced from close and affectionate association, and though the life of our native land is desolate and filled with tears and mourning, nevertheless, these dead, by a just calculation, are happy. First of all, bartering little for much, a brief time for all eternity. They leave behind them an ageless fame in which the children of these men shall be reared in honor, and the parents of these men shall enjoy distinction and tender care in their old age, cherishing the fame of these men as an assuagement of their sorrow. In the second place, immune from disease of body and beyond the reach of anguish of spirit, such as the living must suffer because of the misfortunes which have befallen, they today receive high honor and inspire great emulation, while they are accorded the customary obsequies. How, then, since the whole country unites in according them a public burial, and they alone receive the words of universal praise, while their kinsmen and fellow citizens are not alone in mourning them, but every land that has the right to be called Hellas and the greater part of the whole world mourns with them? How can we do otherwise than consider them blessed of fortune? With excellent reason, one might declare them to be now seated beside the gods below, possessing the same rank as the brave men who have preceded them in the islands of the blessed. For though no man has been there to see or brought back this report concerning them, yet those whom the living have assumed to be worthy of honors in the world above, these, we believe, taking for oracle our own opinion, receive the same honors also in the world beyond. While it is perhaps difficult to mitigate the present misfortunes by the spoken word, nevertheless, it is our duty to endeavor to turn our minds to comforting thoughts, reflecting that it is a beautiful thing for parents who have begotten men like these, and themselves were born of others like unto them, to be seen enduring their affliction more decorously than the rest of mankind, and, no matter what fortune befalls, to be like them. For to the departed, such conduct would seem most becoming in you and honorable to them, and to the whole state and to the living it would bring the greatest glory. It is a grievous thing for fathers and mothers to be deprived of their children, and in their old age to lack the care of those who are nearest and dearest to them. Yes, but it is a proud privilege to behold them possessors of deathless honors, and a memorial of their valor erected by the state, and deemed deserving of sacrifices and games for all future time. It is painful for children to be orphaned of a father, yes, but it is a beautiful thing to be the heir of a father's fame. And of this pain we shall find the deity to be the cause, to whom mortal creatures must yield. But of the glory and honor, the source is found in the choice of those who willed to die nobly As for myself, it has not been my concern how I might make a long speech, but how I might speak the truth. And now, do you, having spent your grief and done your part as law and custom require, disperse to your homes. Thank you for listening to Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. And thank you to Slothinator, the first citizen of Alexandria. I'm always open to feedback or suggestions, so please leave a rating or review on your podcast app of choice. If you want to support the podcast, we have a Patreon. The link to that is in the description. If you want to talk directly, you can find me on Twitter at Alexandria_pod, on Instagram as Alexandria.pod, or on Blue Sky and YouTube as simply Alexandria Pod. You can find bibliography, more contact info, and other goodies on my website, alexandriapod.wordpress.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in Alexandria.